this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football, so tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL. Wasabi is purpose-built to free your business from skyrocketing storage costs and fees. Wasabi is the go-to provider for professional and collegiate sports teams around the world. Check out Wasabi's AI-enabled intelligent media storage, Wasabi Air, to the industry's only cloud storage service with triple protection against cyber criminals. Wasabi, driving innovation in data storage for up to 80% less than market competition. Try for free at wasabi.com. Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage, proud partner of iHeart Podcast Network.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1075 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. First off, it feels good to be back. It feels great to be back. Second, wide receivers really sucked in fantasy football this past year. Now, I'll be doing my yearly episodes on the things I got right and the things that I got wrong next. But I need to start this offseason with an episode on what I think was the biggest storyline in fantasy football this past year. Wide receivers were really, really bad. It's something that I brought up on the show periodically during the season. When I'd make my weekly rankings, wide receiver was always borderline depressing. There were like 8 good players who we cared about, and then there were just a giant group of guys of like 20 to 30 of them who could be mixed around. There wasn't much stability and predictability at the wide receiver position. And end of season data shows that too. In 2025, wide receivers in sum scored the third fewest amount of PPR points that we've seen since 2011. Perhaps what's more interesting is that when you tally up all the running back, wide receiver, and tight end PPR points, wide receivers made up about 46% of that total. That was the lowest that we've seen since 2011 by a full percentage point. So when we look at the number of fantasy points scored by non-quarterbacks, wide receivers scored their lowest proportion of that pie in the last 15 years. You can see this on the individual level too. If you look only at relevant weeks, so you remove the final game of the season, and you use a minimum threshold of 7 games played, we had 13 wide receivers get to 14 or more PPR points per game in 2025. That was the second lowest mark since 2011. In 2024, that number was 26, double what we saw in 2025. When it came to 16 or more PPR points per game, we had 8 of those players in 2025. In 2024, that number was 13, and since 2011, the average has been 12.4. It's not until you get to 18 plus and 20 plus points per game where you start to see some normalization. The super elite wide receivers, they existed in 2025. We had 6 of them with 18 PPR points per game or more. We had 2 of them with 20 or more points per game. So to put all of that another way, wide receivers didn't score a lot of fantasy points in total last year. But we did still have elite wide receivers in fantasy football. It was mostly that next group that really suffered. The obvious question now is, why? There are a number of directions that we can go with that question. Were there more wide receiver injuries among the elite players, leaving less elite talent to score points? Did that next tier of wide receivers just not play very well? Did they just have a weird season from like a touchdown standpoint? Has something fundamentally changed with the way offenses are running in the NFL? Now, there might be at least something to that injury thing. If you look at top 10, top 20, and top 30 wide receivers by ADP and focus only on relevant games, again, removing that final week of the season because a lot of players rest, the 2025 season was below average in games played in each of those groups when compared to all seasons since 2014. Top 10 wide receivers by ADP averaged 13.3 games played. That's driven largely by Malik Neighbors being out. That was the 4th lowest mark out of those 12 seasons. When looking at top 20 wide receivers, it was actually the absolute lowest. That's because Tyreek Hill, Terry McLaurin, Garrett Wilson, and Mike Evans all missed significant time. And then among top 30 wide receivers, we're back to 4th lowest. And keep in mind, the NFL season has 1 extra game these days. So could injuries be playing some role in the low wide receiver scoring last year? Yeah, probably some role. When players of a decent caliber get hurt, inferior players are going to have to step in and fill that void. And that's not easy. Just look at the Jets when Garrett Wilson went down. But that's not everything. To me, the injury stuff is just a small piece of the puzzle. Let's shift back to production for a second. I already mentioned how wide receivers scored the lowest proportion of points that we've seen since at least 2011. They also saw their second lowest target share during that time frame. Why not set a target share just above 58% in 2025? In 2024, that number was 2 percentage points higher. The year prior, almost the exact same. We haven't had a target share this low at wide receiver since 2017. Naturally, a lower target share means fewer targets, fewer receptions, fewer yards, and fewer touchdowns. Just naturally. Touchdowns drive this game and they can be volatile. So that's another place to look with this wide receiver season and how weird it was. And yes, wide receivers, they scored fewer touchdowns than normal in 2025. In fact, their 58% receiving touchdown share was almost 9 percentage points lower than 2024's. That's objectively pretty nuts. Their touchdown share from 2025 was actually the absolute lowest that we've seen since 2011. And maybe there's a little favorable regression that's going to stem from this. The thing is, we know wide receiver targets were down. Their actual targets per touchdown rate wasn't that different from previous seasons. So how wide receivers were converting was actually pretty normal in 2025. They just weren't getting the looks that they usually got. The piece of information I haven't shared yet that brings a lot of this together and takes us down this new rabbit hole is how targets were generally distributed in 2025. Not just at wide receiver, but at running back and tight end too. Like I already said, we saw this low of a wide receiver target share back in 2017. The difference in 2017, though, was that running backs were the ones who benefited most from that lack of wide receiver target share. For example, back in 2017, when wide receiver target share was the lowest that it's been since 2011, running back target shares were around 21.6%. That's the highest mark of any season since 2011. Meaning those wide receiver targets were basically going to the running back position. But this past year, running back target share was 18%. That was the second lowest running back target share that we've seen since 2011, beating only the 2024 season. So the last 2 years have seen the lowest running back target shares over the last 15 seasons. There's only one position left who can see targets. It's tight end. And that's where this missing target share is going. The game of football evolves. Offenses tend to do something new, defenses then react to that new trend, and then offenses, they're forced to find a new way to beat those defenses. Over the last handful of years, in order to keep up with pass-heavy, wide receiver-heavy offenses, defenses became lighter and faster. We see more defensive backs on the field to counter the evolved passing concepts that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years. But NFL offenses know this, and many of them, they've started to run out of heavier personnel. If you have versatile tight ends who can both block well and catch well, that gives offenses an advantage to run the football better and take advantage of these defenses. We're really seeing this at a macro level. The NFL's pass rate this past year was the lowest of any season since at least 2011. Last year, it was the second lowest. So we've seen the two run-heaviest seasons over the last 2 years. Meanwhile, according to Fantasy Life data, the average team ran out of 12 personnel, 2 tight end sets, at about a 22.4% rate in 2025. That was the highest since 2020, when this data dates back to. The 2024 season was at 21.8%. That was the second highest mark. All other seasons were under 20%. To give you some more context around this, last season, 7 teams ran out of 12 personnel on 30% or more of their offensive snaps. In 2024, that was 5 teams. From 2020 through 2023, so across 4 NFL seasons, there were a total of 6 teams who did that, a total of them. Last year alone, we had 7. When a team runs more 12 personnel, it means they're not running as much 11 personnel or an offensive grouping with 3 wide receivers on the field. 11 personnel really spiked when Sean McVay was introduced to the world when he became the Rams head coach back in 2017. But we've seen 11 personnel usage decline over the last couple of seasons. It really declined, though, in 2025. This past year was exceptionally different. According to Fantasy Life data, teams on average ran out of 11 personnel on about 56-57% of their offensive plays. Just last year, that number was 61%. That's a pretty big decline. But what's kind of interesting here is the frequency in which teams ran a lot of 11 personnel. I'm talking like over 70% of their snaps. Not a single team was over that 70% mark in 2025. 10 of them were over that mark in 2024. And the average from 2020 to 2024 has been 6.8 teams per season hitting an 11 personnel rate of 70% or greater. This year, the highest was Tennessee, directly at 70%. Now, to be clear, football isn't a game of two personnel groupings. Those are just two very, very common ones. And they're two that can influence this game that we love analyzing, which of course is fantasy football. Think about what this shift in personnel really means. 11 personnel sees 3 wide receivers on the field at once. 12 personnel sees fewer wide receivers. So in turn, that would mean that wide receivers are generally running fewer routes. And if they're running fewer routes, they're also scoring fewer fantasy points. And that's generally true. According to PFF data, wide receivers saw a 14-year low in routes run per dropback this past year. So wide receiver route share was at its lowest. And unsurprisingly, tight end route share was at its highest in at least 15 seasons. Now we could stop there and conclude that wide receivers, specifically the non-elite ones, they were so bad in 2025 because of this shift in personnel grouping. Because they were running fewer routes. But there's still a lot more to this story. Not only were wide receivers running slightly fewer routes per dropback, but they were being targeted at a lower frequency too. In fact, their targets per route run rate last year, according to PFF data, was the lowest since 2011. Now, it'd be one thing if they were running fewer routes, but being targeted at a higher rate than normal. But no, it's this compounding factor. They're running slightly fewer routes, and their targets per route run is also lower. Those two things combined can really lower the output for the position. Meanwhile, tight ends, as we know, they're already running more routes than they have in recent history. And they're also being targeted per route run at a slightly above average rate. What this tells me is that quarterbacks aren't just throwing to tight ends because they're on the field more. That's part of it, of course. But because the targets per route run rates were what they were, it seems to me that quarterbacks might be choosing to throw to tight ends more. They're not just doing it because it's some default. Fantasy Points Data Suite offers first read target share, and it goes back to 2021. So the last 5 seasons. According to that data, when looking at all first read targets among wide receivers and tight ends by year, tight end first read target share was highest in 2025. So it wasn't just general targets going to tight ends, it was the first read for some of these quarterbacks. Now, this is something that's a little bit harder to quantify because I'm not in the building with these teams and with these coaching staffs. But this is sort of the breakdown of what I think is happening for a lot of NFL teams right now, or at least what we saw in 2025. First, they're adjusting to what defenses have given them. Defenses are lighter, they're quicker, and teams have gone heavier and they're running the ball more. Not only are they running the ball more, though, they're doing so effectively. According to some data pulled by Late Rounds Brandon Gadula, 2025 was the 3rd most efficient season since 1999 in rushing EPA per rush. Meanwhile, we didn't see that kind of jump from a passing efficiency standpoint. In other words, the advantage of running the football became better in 2025. Now, another thing to point out here is that 2 high safeties have become dominant in recent history. Defenses are looking to prevent those splash plays. That's why we've seen wide receiver average depth of target drop over the last 5 or 6 seasons. This could be another reason that quarterbacks are opting to go to tight ends more frequently. It's not necessarily because wide receivers can't run those shallower routes. It's that tight ends are just doing it more often. And with teams running more 12 personnel, tight ends are on the field more. So they're getting some of that lower ADOT production. So in total, tight ends are running more routes than usual, and they're being targeted at a higher rate per route run. And that's hurting wide receivers a lot.
This is Julian Edelman from Games with Names. Now let's get into the serious stuff. We're talking football food, specifically Daisy French onion dip.
That is serious.
Gotta try these delicious new dips from Daisy. These are so delicious, they're like homemade dips. Made with real herb and spices and other ingredients you'll find in your kitchen. Also made with some Daisy sour cream. Daisy sour cream is a long-standing staple for Taco Tuesday.
You know what I do? When I get my street burrito, I get the squirt Daisy.
Yeah.
And every bite. I know you.
I'm a huge sour cream guy. I love sour cream.
On top.
So I think burritos can't live without sour cream.
I completely agree with that.
They also have Daisy Ranch dip. I love ranch dip.
Yeah, it was great.
I love it with crackers, wings, plain potato chip, the ones with the little crinkles, maybe some bell peppers. So get out there and give Daisy French onion dip a try. You will not regret it.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football, so tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
In my opinion, what this shift in personnel grouping does is two things. Number one, it makes lower-tiered wide receivers less relevant. If they can't find the field, they're not going to score as many fantasy points. Or even if they're on the field, there's a higher chance of them losing targets to a tight end. That wouldn't be the case as much for a stud wide receiver because stud wide receivers, they're going to get good target shares in any environment. But then number two, we know that teams are now running the ball more because of defensive adjustments and what heavy personnel generally allows you to do against those defenses. So even if you have a stud wide receiver on a team that runs a lot of 12 personnel or a lot of tight end heavy groupings, that stud wide receiver may still have a hard time being a stud in fantasy football because his team isn't throwing the ball as much. And this is a huge reason we saw what we saw in fantasy football this past season. Specifically, it's why we saw such little help from wide receivers in the late rounds of our fantasy drafts. Think about it. What I'm really saying here is that elite wide receivers, they're at a premium. With this change in the way NFL offenses are running things, we technically have fewer wide receivers who are relevant to the game. 2025 had the second fewest wide receivers since 2011 get to a 10% target share. It tied for the lowest amount of wide receivers getting to a 15% target share. It was below average when looking at 20% target share players, and it starts to normalize a little bit as you get closer to the high 20s. Target share is going to correlate to fantasy success, which means the guys who are actually getting those looks, they're the ones separating themselves even more. And this shows up in average draft position data too. You may think that with wide receivers being worse in fantasy, that it would mean to wait on the position, because the position as a whole is scoring less. Now, that would be valid if every wide receiver was scoring less, but that's not the case. What's really bringing this all down are the players who are drafted in the late single-digit rounds and into the double-digit rounds of your drafts. Fantasy Data's average draft position data goes back to 2014. I use that data to look at all wide receivers who were drafted after pick 84, which represents the end of the 7th round in a 12-team fantasy draft. This past year, the 2025 season, saw the lowest rate of wide receivers coming from those rounds who finished top 24, top 30, and top 36 of the position. I mean, guys, we had one top 24 wide receiver in PPR points per game come from the 8th round or later last year. One. It was Wan'Dale Robinson. He probably wouldn't have even finished that high had Malik Neighbors not gotten hurt. Now, keep in mind, I'm referring to drafted players here. This goes for all seasons analyzed. Christian Watson, Michael Wilson, they did sneak into the top 24, but they weren't drafted. But that happens in other seasons too. That's not unique to 2025. The fact of the matter is that these secondary wide receivers, they weren't nearly as useful as we've seen in previous seasons. Maybe you could say the market's getting smarter and all the good wide receivers are just drafted early now. But that still results in the same thing when it comes to our draft strategies moving forward. And that's elevating the truly, truly elite wide receivers in this game. Like, this all doesn't mean that we should avoid wide receivers in the early parts of our draft, just because the wide receiver position in total wasn't very good. It means we probably shouldn't rely heavily on wide receivers drafted in the latter parts of our draft. NFL teams are running the ball more, and they're running the ball more out of heavier personnel. That means fewer wide receivers are going to be on the field. And when fewer wideouts are on the field, it means we have fewer relevant ones to choose from in fantasy football. There are fewer chances to hit on a middle and late round pick. And that's only reinforced by the idea that teams are opting to throw to tight ends more frequently. Having an above average wide receiver on your fantasy team back in 2015, 2016 could have yielded a pretty nice fantasy season in the right environment. But now, those above average wide receivers by talent, they're at risk of losing routes and losing target share to tight ends. That makes the stable pieces, the ones we feel really good about seeing a lot of volume, that makes them more valuable, not less valuable. because they're unicorns. Targets run this game for wide receivers. Volume is everything. For a wide receiver to see volume, he either needs to have a high target share, play in an offense that throws the ball a lot, or both. With the NFL's offensive environment changing the way it is, the elite wide receivers are still seeing high target shares. In fact, you could argue the elite wide receivers are seeing even higher target shares than normal. Because in heavier personnel groupings, they're competing for targets with tight ends instead of other wide receivers. That makes it easier for an elite wide receiver to see a target on a given dropback, because he's easily the best pass catcher on the field. That's just not the case for a more mediocre wide receiver. The downside of that is passing volume. Teams are naturally going to run the ball more if their formation includes these bigger bodied players, and if they want to beat the ordinary defense in today's NFL. So the players who are being hurt most, they're the ones who aren't quite good enough to see an elite target share, because chances are their offense isn't as pass heavy as it was 3 or 4 years ago. And that's why the fantasy football wide receiver 2 is dying. It's becoming flatter. Teams are heavier, they're running more, and tight ends, they're capable enough to take both route share and target share away from the more average to above average wide receivers. Meanwhile, the elite guys, they're sticking around. And look, guys, admittedly, a lot of this stuff has been happening and changing over the last few years, but 2025 was a huge shift in all of it. Whether you look at touchdown share, tight end target share, 12 personnel usage, all of it was a pretty big shift. But in my opinion, it's going to be pretty difficult for defenses to fully adjust in just one offseason. Maybe this is some apex and things revert back to like 2024 levels here in 2026. But even if that's the case, we should probably conclude the same thing. Elite wide receivers are really valuable in fantasy football if you can find them. And that's a big if, because there's not a ton of them right now. And then that next tier of player, it's going to have a hard time differentiating itself from the rest of the pack. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. This first week back is going to look a little bit different than the rest of the podcast schedule this offseason. Usually in the offseason, I alternate Fridays with the mailbag and then perspectives. But this Friday, you'll get an episode of me going over the things that I got wrong this past year. I like to dig into my process to see if I was a moron or if I just got unlucky. And then a week from now, I'll do the same thing with the things that I got right. But thanks for listening, everyone. I'll catch you later this week.
Get almost anything you need delivered with Uber Eats. What do we mean by almost? Well, you can't get a well-groomed lawn delivered, but you can get a chicken parm delivered. A little escape? No. A delicious bowl of grapes? Yes, that. An afternoon stroll? Sorry, no. A burrito bowl? Happily, yes. A day of sunshine? No. A box of fine wines? Yes. Uber Eats can definitely get you that. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now. Alcohol in select markets. Product availability may vary by region. See app for details. Get almost anything delivered with Uber Eats. Order now.
This is Julian Edelman from Games with Names. Now let's get into the serious stuff. We're talking football food, specifically Daisy French onion dip. These are so delicious. They're like homemade dips, made with real herb and spices, also made with some Daisy sour cream. Daisy sour cream is a long-standing staple for Taco Tuesday. They also have Daisy ranch dip. So get out there and give Daisy French onion dip a try. You will not regret it.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.